Before Valve was known as the biggest and most influential video game company in the world, they were struggling to find a publisher for their very first game. Had they not found one, the industry would have looked very different. So how did Valve take over the industry even though nobody believed in them at first? Valve's story begins in 1996. After years of working at Microsoft and developing the most annoying OS, Windows, Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington quit the company and founded Valve, on Gabe Newell's wedding day no less. Anyway, Valve started working on their first game, Half-Life. They took the Quake engine and modified it into their own gold source engine. It was basically a mod, and mods would become very important in a few years. After struggling to find a publisher, Valve eventually signed with Sierra Online and released Half-Life in November 1998. The game went ballistic. It was not only a critical and commercial success, but according to IGN, the history of the FPS genre breaks down pretty cleanly into pre-Half-Life and post-Half-Life eras. The game was so influential that years later, a group of fans developed a remake of the game and called it simply Black Mesa. That remake was approved by Valve, and today it's close to 400,000 copies sold. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Valve realized that they needed to make more games and hired Gearbox Software to develop 3 expansions for Half-Life: Opposing Force, Blue Shift, and Decay. Without wasting a bit, they also acquired TF Software, a group that made the popular Team Fortress mod for Quake and remade it for Gold Source as Team Fortress Classic in 1999. Remember how I told you that modding was going to become very important to Valve? Get this, Valve released the software development kit, known as SDK, for the Gold Source engine, and it opened the gates for a gazillion fan-made mods. But one of those mods in particular had caught the attention of both the community and Valve itself. You probably already know what I'm talking about, a mod that grew into a standalone game that redefined competitive gaming, and which many companies would try to copy but ultimately fail. I'm talking about Counter-Strike.
Let's roll.
It's funny to think about. A game that a lot of us spent our teenage years playing started out as a mod, and it came to life simply because me and Lee, who had previously worked on mods such as Navy SEALs for Quake and Action Quake 2, wanted to create his own mod to have more control over development. Let me explain. Let's say you are working on a new video game. If you work at a small indie company, then the chances are that you have some control and say over what's happening with the game. Now, imagine you work at a slightly bigger company. Suddenly, the priorities shift and you lose some control. The bigger the company, the bigger that shift gets. For example, I recently attended a seminar hosted by the composers of a AAA project. They shared their experience working on that title. There were over 5 hosts, and those people were at the tip of the iceberg who had people working for them. The chain of so-called command was rather long, and that's just the music department. That's one of the reasons why big breakthroughs usually come from smaller teams. They simply have less to lose, and the upside of a different game is very appealing. That's why me and Lee wanted to have more control over the project, but he wasn't going to do it alone. He teamed up with Jazz Cliff, and when the Half-Life SDK was finally released on April 7th, 1999, mod development officially began, and Min Lee's reputation from Action Quake 2 led to the mod receiving significant attention even before it was released. The website had over 10,000 visitors within just 2.5 weeks. That's like way more than this video is going to get. Now, how did the game become so popular? Today we take the game series for granted, almost as the standard of competitive gaming. The answer is as simple as the core gameplay loop. It's easy to understand, but it takes thousands of hours to truly master it. Each weapon had a different spray pattern. You had to manage your money, learn grenade lineups, typical enemy positioning, and coordinate with your team. Unlike most other games at the time, you only had 1 life per round, which made every decision count. And lastly, the game was skill-based. That was enough to create an army of fans. That's when Valve thought, okay, we have the Half-Life universe and Counter-Strike fans, we need to go further. But to go further, they had to solve a giant problem in the face of Sierra Online. You see, Sierra owned the Half-Life IP for a significant period, and it was only in 2001 that Valve managed to get it back. That was the single most important moment for the company, because had they not gotten the agreement, we might have never gotten the next games in Steam. And if you were around at the time of the official release, you may remember how skeptical people were of Steam. Not everyone was willing to download a piece of software, to download another piece of software, to download another piece of software. That was a problem, because at its core, Steam was a way to update Valve's games more efficiently and implement stronger anti-piracy and anti-cheat measures. So how did they solve this problem? One word: exclusivity. Valve was working on a new game, Half-Life 2, and funny enough, the development actually started 6 months after the release of the original game. They wanted it to be, as the marketing people say, bigger, better, stronger. As Gabe Newell put it, why spend 4 years of your life building something that isn't innovative and is basically pointless? If Half-Life 2 isn't viewed as the best PC game of all time, it's going to completely bum out most of the guys on this team. The team had no deadline and a virtually unlimited budget. Gabe even promised to fund the project himself if necessary. That's literally the ideal circumstance to develop a groundbreaking game. When you have a lot of money and time, you can try your wildest ideas. And not just try, scratch that. You can take as long as you need to actually make your ideas work. To make them work, Valve used their brand new engine, Source, which was developed simultaneously. They integrated the Havoc physics engine and generally worked hard on the graphical side of the game. But before we get to the release of the game and how it was vital to Valve's reputation, do you remember Sierra Online from a few minutes ago? Well, there was another lawsuit in 2002. Maybe it's common knowledge among die-hard fans, but I was genuinely surprised to learn that when the company that had acquired Sierra Online started licensing Counter-Strike to cybercafes, Valve filed a lawsuit after the company wouldn't agree that cybercafe deals fell outside of the original agreement. The company then escalated like crazy, hitting Valve with multiple counterclaims, including seeking ownership of the entire Half-Life IP and blocking Steam. That lawsuit hung over the entire duration of the development of Half-Life 2. So how did Valve win? A Korean-speaking intern discovered evidence that the company had been destroying documents related to the case. I'm not even kidding, that's just insane. Think twice before you sign anything, guys. Anyway, remember that Valve needed an exclusive title to make Steam popular, right? So Half-Life 2 was exactly that. The stakes were high not only because of Steam, but also because of how groundbreaking the game was shaping up to be. And that's when Valve hit another bump in the road. The Half-Life 2 source code was obtained by German hacker Axel Gembe, I'm sorry if I'm butchering his name, who had simply hacked into Valve's internal network months earlier. Fans rushed to compile a playable version and realized that the game was very unfinished. Valve obviously didn't like it. Imagine having something you've spent 4 years working on getting leaked for free. That slowed the development process, and Gabe started working with the FBI to catch the man. Axel was sentenced to 2 years of probation. In the meantime, Steam was released out of beta on September 12, 2003. So in November 2004, Half-Life was the first high-profile game to be offered on Steam. It even required the installation of the Steam client for retail copies, and Steam had a mixed reception. Some people were okay with it, others were against it. Why would you install a program that installs another program on your computer? That was the core issue. But Valve's reasoning was just as simple. You get regular updates for the games you already own. So at this point, Valve had survived a lawsuit that nearly bankrupted them, had their most ambitious game leaked by a hacker, and released Steam, which had a mixed reception. But here is the thing about Half-Life 2 and Valve's games in general. Half-Life 2 was just so good that people downloaded Steam anyway. The game launched in November 2004, and it was a groundbreaking masterpiece. The physics engine alone was unlike anything people had ever seen before. Like, what do you mean you can pick up a barrel and throw it at an enemy? Critics gave it a perfect score across the board, and the game won over 35 Game of the Year awards. But more importantly, it proved that Steam could work. If you wanted to play the best game of the year, you had to make a Steam account. Valve basically used Half-Life 2 as a Trojan horse to get Steam onto millions of computers. Over time, Steam started picking out third-party publishers and games. At that point, it was clear that digital distribution is the future of the industry. By the mid-2000s, Steam was becoming the default way to buy PC games, and Valve was taking a 30% cut of every sale. That cut would eventually make them one of the most profitable companies in gaming without ever having to make another game. And yet, they still make them. because that amount of money also meant that they were not tied to anyone or had any hard deadlines. They, practically speaking, had a money printing machine that could sustain ungodly periods of game development. All they had to do was keep acquiring publishers and game developers and maintaining Steam. Speaking of making more games, Half-Life 2 ended on a cliffhanger, so Valve announced that they were going to do something different. Instead of making a full sequel, they would release episodic content. Yeah, kinda like The Walking Dead. Anyway, the first episode, called Episode 1, was released in 2006. Episode 2 went live in 2007. Each one was critically praised and loved by fans. Everyone wanted to see the ending of the story. So the third episode came out and… What do I mean snore come out? What? Yeah, Half-Life 2 Episode 3 never came out. There have always been rumors about the third episode or maybe even a proper third installment of the series. It's gotten to the point where any tiny hint that could theoretically point to Half-Life 3 causes a meltdown in r/Half-Life, copium, and all that. I think I lose my mind every time I see this wild world. Anyway, while all of this was happening, Valve had quietly been working on something else. Do you remember Team Fortress Classic? Yeah, if you were born after like 2005, you probably don't, but it doesn't matter, because Valve didn't acquire it for nothing. All this time, they'd been working on a full remake of it, and in 2007 they released Team Fortress 2. It was colorful, cartoony, and it stood out. The mid-2000s gaming landscape looked very gray and too serious. It was all either gritty or realistic. Team Fortress 2, on the other hand, showed up looking like a bloody Disney princess. And it kinda worked. The characters from the game became iconic almost immediately. Valve released a series of short, animated films for each class, and those films were so well made that people watched them just for fun, even if they weren't interested in the game itself. I know I wasn't, but I enjoyed them a lot. Team Fortress 2 became one of the first games that proved that if you put in the work and maintain your game with updates, the game can stay relevant for decades. I mean, look at the number of players. This is a screenshot from 2026. It's crazy. But what also helped the popularity of Team Fortress 2 was Valve's decision to make it free-to-play in 2011 and to introduce hats. It's a meme at this point. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the short version is that Valve added cosmetic items, hats mostly, that players could find, trade, or buy. It sounds funny, and it was funny, but it created an entire online economy. Players were trading virtual hats for real money, moolah, cash. A single hat could go for hundreds of dollars if it was rare enough. Valve, probably without even wanting to, accidentally created a microtransaction model that would go on to influence basically the entire industry. And once again, even if you hate cosmetic items, you can appreciate the irony. Nobody believed it would be a real income source, and once again, everybody watched Valve do it. Now let's talk about Counter-Strike again. Valve wasn't done with it after acquiring it. In 2004 they released Counter-Strike Source, basically the next installment of the game series, but made entirely on the new Source engine. It looked better, had Half-Life 2 physics, and was received well enough. But here's an interesting thing. The vast majority of the original CS community refused to move over to CSS. They kept playing CS 1.6 for years. So the player base split, and there were genuine arguments about which game was superior. I myself was somewhere in the middle. I enjoyed both games, but for different reasons. CSS was more of a fun game to me. I would play mods like Zombie Escape and Gun Game, while CS 1.6 was still the competitive one, at least for me. And Valve felt that split. In 2012, Valve released CSGO, which initially was just a port of CSS to consoles. That's why we had the circle of a menu. It was made to make life easier for console players. Ironically, the console version never really took off and is now long forgotten. The PC version, well, it launched with modest numbers and people were skeptical. But bada bing bada boom, and the game slowly took over the industry as the competitive esports game, with tournament prize pools of millions of dollars. At its peak, CSGO had over 1 million concurrent players. Once again, people were skeptical about something Valve had made, and somehow it took over the world. There's a pattern here. But Valve was a huge company and, as I said, they had a money printing machine in the form of Steam. They were free to experiment with anything and everything, hire anyone they felt was the best addition to their creative team. That's how we got Left 4 Dead. It was released in 2008, and it was a co-op zombie shooter built around a concept that sounds simple. 4 players, overwhelming hordes of zombies, and you have to get from point A to point B. The genius, however, wasn't the AI director. It was an invisible system that monitored how well your team was doing and adjusted the difficulty in real time. Doing good? Here are a few dozen more zombies and a tank. Doing bad? Alright, I'll back off. It made every playthrough feel unique, and it made the game almost infinitely replayable. Left 4 Dead also understood that in order to make co-op truly matter, the system had to punish those who didn't work together. If you split up, you die. If you don't help a teammate, you die. If you die, you die. It was great. Not perfect, but great. Then in 2009, just a year after the release of the first game, Valve dropped Left 4 Dead 2. People were very confused. First of all, how can you make an improved version of the game in just a year? And secondly, people felt that it might be just a cash grab. It's understandable. But Left 4 Dead 2 was better than the original game in almost every aspect and is considered to be one of the best co-op games ever created. Wait, almost every aspect? Yeah, well, you see, I'm a sound design guy and a music nerd. I think that those two are made to serve the game, and in the next video, we'll put those two games against each other and see which one has a better atmosphere and which one has better sound design. Anyway, now that I'm done with this shameless plug, let's move on. We have one more game to talk about, and that game is Dota 2. Here is the development story in a nutshell. A Warcraft 3 mod, community maps, a mysterious developer known as IceFrog. You know what? It's a whole separate video. The short version of it is that Valve hired IceFrog, acquired the rights to develop a sequel, and released Dota 2 in 2013. What matters for our story is the impact. Dota 2's international tournament in 2013 had a prize pool of $2.8 million. By 2019, that number had grown to over $34 million, becoming the largest prize pool in esports history at the time. It was largely funded by the community through in-game purchases. Remember when I joked about the money printing machine? Yeah, this is it, when it's put to a good cause. So let's summarize this insane story. By the early 2010s, a company that was struggling to even find a publisher for the first game had the most dominant digital store on the planet, 2 of the most played competitive shooters in the world, one of the biggest esport titles on the planet, and a self-sustaining economy that was sponsoring everything. They went from a company that couldn't find a publisher to a company that didn't need a publisher at all, from a team that people dismissed to the company that defined an entire generation of video games. Steam alone was estimated to control around 75% of the PC gaming market, and they did it almost every single time by releasing something that nobody thought was going to work. Nobody wanted Steam, nobody wanted an ADHD over-the-top cartoony shooter, nobody wanted CSGO, nobody believed that hats, well, things would become a huge driver of income, and yet, Valve made it all happen.